Hi, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me. So, this is really most people's impression of Pompeii. Um, but obviously, this image taken a few years ago. It's a little bit more deserted now because of COVID. But what I want to do this evening is primarily to do something a little bit different. It is focused on Pompeii, so I'm going to not just talk about 1943. I'm going to talk a little bit about an aspect of the history of Pompeii, but really it is, as I said, just there to give you a different thought or different impression of Pompeii. In terms of learning in for future modules, it is to try to also encourage you to continue your interest in classics. Hopefully it'll give you an impetus to go and do a little bit of research or some study before future modules, or if you're wavering between doing classical studies or some other subject, hopefully this might push you a little bit in that direction. But I suppose the important element that I want to try and do with this talk is to give the impression that I'm very knowledgeable about the subject area. So this is a topic that came to me when I was giving a tour of Pompeii just before the lockdown. In fact, it was just before the lockdown in Italy, where I was taking a tour group around Pompeii, and we were chatting away, and I felt I needed to say something, and just it popped into my head and made the point that, of course, the Allies had bombed Pompeii in 1943. And one of the people who was paying attention said, "Really?" So at that stage, I realized I had said something that I perhaps should not have said because it's not a topic I knew a great deal amount about. So I went into a slight little bit of panic, but then years of experience came in and sort of stood by me, and I turned around and said, "Yes," and then continued to walk. So at least I'd given the impression that I was quite knowledgeable about that, and they didn't quiz me any further, but it gave me the incentive to look into this subject a little bit more. So this is an aerial view of Pompeii, and if you think about it, really it does look like it's a site that's been bombed. So there is a similarity to a bomb site in relation to one of the cities that were bombed in 1940s and 1930s during the Second World War, and the excavated ruins of Pompeii. So obviously there are clear differences between the two of them, and I want to make a few little points in relation to that as we move through. So before we talk about 1943, let's go back into the past and a little bit back into the original origins of Pompeii, when it was initially discovered and when they were trying to establish underground aqueducts for the mills of Torre and Noziana. I'm going to have difficulty pronouncing this all the way through, but it was really discovered by accident in 1592. And as Domenico Fontana was a very professional individual, he decided not to tell anyone what was happening, but found a little bit later on. But Pompeii, when it was initially discovered properly and excavated, it really became part of the Grand Tour of the 17th and 18th century, where we have it was part of the rite of passage for young, in particular aristocratic males. So this sort of gives you an impression of the Grand Tour, where aristocratic males from the likes of the UK would travel around Europe, visit the ruins of Italy, and in particular Pompeii, and as I said, will become part of their rites of passage. I've got another image here, which I think gives that a very good impression of that. You can see individuals here that look, very well dressed amongst the ruins, and here we have a lady with her parasol. So it became, as I said, one of those things that wealthy individuals do, sort of pass their youth, so to speak. But this is something I want to, this sort of sowing a little seed for what I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. But this, we're talking about Pompeii, this is, and the preservation of Pompeii. It was very much focused on that sort of elite mindset, and on the sort of population that were living around Pompeii, and the less wealthy were not really that important and insignificant. So it was really the focus of that sort of elite travel and, I suppose, elite learning. So moving ahead quickly into Probably one of those the most important excavators, at least in my in view, is Vittorio Spinzola, who was the superintendente of the Archeologica de Pompeii, the director of Pompeii, as it says here, from 1911 to 1923. And why he's significant is he did help to sort of set some of the standards in terms of excavation, but why he's most significant is because he takes photographic evidence. And the prime area that he focused on is the Via di Abbondanza. And the Via di Abbondanza is this road here that I'm highlighting along here. So what I would do is what I suppose traditionally people would do when they're talking about lectures, of course, we all know about which road we're talking about. So to make me the person who's talking about sound much more knowledgeable, but certainly this is the main road. The Via di Abbondanza means the way of abundance. And we move through, let's have a look at some of the images of that. This is part of his excavation. This is the upper part of one of those buildings that was found in the Via di Abbondanza. And you can see all these columns up here. And the lower part here hasn't been fully excavated. And this is 1912, but as I said to you earlier on, you can see clear photographic evidence. This is what makes his excavation so exciting. Also, this gives you an impression of the depths in which they went down to uncover Pompeii. You see various dignitaries around here, probably a carabinieri or a polizia individuals standing here in the background. But we're looking at a depth between 4 to 5 meters, which is very deep. And it does mean that it's not just looking at lower floors, but we also have upper floors. That's why I was showing you the point about the columns a little bit later on, a little bit earlier on. And what the great thing about these photographs is that you can see the state of preservation of the frescoes. Admittedly, yes, this is black and white, but we can see here there's an entrance into a shop and looks like a shop sign. For those of you who have listened to me talk before, they know that one of my research interests is in shops, and it's one of the reasons why I'm showing you this image is because of this. But we can see the early excavations, the excavation material been removed here. So it is a very labor intensive process. And although I'm telling you it's a labor intensive process, it was done very quickly and very rapidly. Here we have a further image of it. Again, this gives you a better impression, as I said to you earlier on, about the depth in which they've gone down to get down to the lower levels of AD 79. And here is the building I talked to a little bit earlier on with some of the columns on it. And I think just over here is the shop sign. So this is just giving you an impression of the early excavations taking place by Spinzola, probably the start of the more modern forms of excavation. But it's important, and I think this one of the things I was going to emphasize, which I forgot to say a little bit earlier on, is the importance of context. And that's one of the points I want to emphasize in terms of learning and looking at source materials. Always try to put things into context. Spinzola himself is not excavating alone. He's excavating in the context of wider political and sociological changes. And one of those is 1922, and we have Mussolini. Now, Mussolini, he's an individual that sees and adopts ancient Rome and sees that as part of the modern political process. And it's very well illustrated here, I think, on the right-hand side. Here we have Mussolini giving a salute, and over beside him here is a statue of Augustus. But part of what Mussolini is doing, he's trying to celebrate modern Italy and linking that back into the domination of ancient Rome. And he's removing an awful lot of stuff that he felt was insignificant, unimportant. And he was one of the instigators that removed an awful lot of the medieval material and post-medieval material from the Forum Romanum to expose the Roman remains. So he wants to focus on that. This we have here is a front of him giving the impression that he's the first person that puts the pick in to remove what he thinks is irrelevant material that doesn't really reflect what he wants to have as the new Italy. So why am I bringing Mussolini into this? Well, Mussolini, being a fascist, took over political domination, and Spinzola was quite friends with, or supposed to be friendly with, the former prime minister, Francisco Nutti, and he was another socialist, and he was very much critical of the fascist regime. So it was thought that Spinzola, because of his relationship here, was removed by Mussolini, because Mussolini, it's not just talking about Roman history. He could see how the archaeological remains could be linked into the new Italy and give the foundations for his new fascist regime. So Spinzola was removed as a result of this, perhaps. Certainly, this is what his son mentions in his biography in relation to Spinzola. But as he's an academic and a scholar, they have often had quite a number of rivals. So there might have been other wranglings taking place. So certainly, it does seem, by talking about his relationship with Nitti, it does suggest that he's a much more bigger player than perhaps he was. But the truth is, we don't know why he was removed. But he was removed and replaced by Amaretto Murani, and he becomes a new superintendente. And you can see, he's quite a jovial chap here with pulling the nose of Antonius Pius. But if you look at the length of time in which he was director of Pompeii, from 1924 to 61, he's a very important and significant individual in the history of Pompeii. So it's not just talking about the bombing of Pompeii, but we're really talking about the history of his relationship with Pompeii. But who is this character? Now, I've just mentioned to you that Spinzola might have been removed because his disagreement with the fascist regime. So would Moriani, would he be a person that is perhaps linked in with a fascist regime? And this is something that is a topic of quite an amount of scholarly debate. But we can see here, this is him looking over here in Pompeii, and this is him walking alongside Mussolini. So in 1922, he visited Pompeii, and he gets a tour of Pompeii. But this is again another picture of Murani with Mussolini walking through the streets of Pompeii, Via Consolari, towards the Herculaneum Gate, and perhaps the most famous picture that is taken of Mussolini's visitation to Pompeii is the Herculaneum Gate. And this is him. This is them walking towards the Villa of the Mysteries, and this is a modern image of what it looks like, shall we say, nowadays. So it would seem that he does have quite a good relationship, but I think it is this picture here in 1935 where he's showing Mussolini ground in the area of Paestum, which is a group of Greek temples just further to the south of Pompeii, which Morani himself was also in charge here. And you can see him wearing what seems to be the fascist logo here, and the black shirt. The Sam Brown belt, which is probably black. So he does seem to be dressed in sort of military garb. This is him, look, again wearing a black shirt, and what we have here is the educational minister Giuseppe wearing a fascist military regalia. So it does seem to show that he does have quite close links with the fascist regime. But perhaps this is really more about his role as a director, that he does have to wear this sort of uniform garb as part of his role. So perhaps he was an ardent fascist. Some of his earlier writing does seem to show links, but maybe he's just being politically prudent. Ultimately, Morani himself joins into the sort of the Italiata, which is the policy of the time, which is sort of embracing the Italian identity. And the real emphasis of this, and this is where Morani himself is showing a picture of him in the excavations of Herculaneum, Herculano. And the Alducci, Mussolini claims this as a work of national importance. And you get an impression here, if you're looking at the poster over here, where we can see the rock been lifted above what's supposed to be Herculaneum down here below. And the excavations of Herculaneum, in contrast to Pompeii, was really a Herculean task. It required an awful lot of modern equipment been brought in, heavy equipment to remove the debris, the sort of the solidified mud, which is different from the pumice that existed in Pompeii. But what was very significant to Morani is that Mussolini funded him a great deal of money and allowed him opportunity, the legal opportunity to remove the domestic accommodation that were above Herculaneum to allow them to carry out excavations. So this might give you an impression that in some ways that I'm sort of digressing slightly, but there is a reason why I want to put this in. You can see again the depths in which the excavations are taking place in Pompeii. There is a suggestion that this may be a pneumatic drill. I'm not sure about that, but you can see the train work over here and the excavations as they're currently being uncovered. But the reason for showing you this image in particular is here. Is this latter part in the background is they're rebuilding some of the aspects of Herculaneum. So this is what they've uncovered, and this is what they've actually reconstructed. So this is something that you need to think about when you're walking through Herculaneum and you're walking through Pompeii, that there are going to be levels of reconstruction to consolidate the ancient ruins. So Herculaneum in particular has been reconstructed as a showpiece of the success of the fascist regime in some ways. For those of you that have visited Pompeii, there's a lovely building that's been reconstructed where it's almost like been cut through so you can see inside the upper floors, and that seems to have been intentionally done so that people can see the impressive remains and how impressive Herculaneum was. And there probably are going to be similarities in Pompeii, but certainly not to the same levels. Now, I mentioned to you a little bit earlier on about Pompeii itself being part of this sort of fascist ideas and ideals. And we can see, looking from 1936, this is a nice image from the amphitheater in Pompeii, and we can see Italian soldiers gather together. So they were going to see the ancient ruins, and I suppose the idea is that they feel part of that long tradition of Italian domination, that Roman domination. Another further impression of that, you can see what seems to be, I think, more fascist architecture here in the background, but the amphitheater. I'm afraid I don't know what these uniforms are, but this, I think, is a charming image here on the right-hand side of what is clearly an Italian officer. So it's 1937, we can see that things are getting closer to the Second World War. And this image here, moving away from Italian soldiers, what we can see here are German officers and ratings. Presumably these are from U-boat crews that are stopped outside Naples or in Naples. And that's something, before I forget, there is a naval base and a submarine base in Naples. So these are probably visiting Naples, and part of their visit to Naples was a visitation to Pompeii in 1938. But things changed on the 10th of June in 1940, when Mussolini makes a decision to enter the Second World War alongside the Germans. So it really is from the very start, and the point I'm trying to make here is that I'm talking and focusing on the bombing of Pompeii in 1943, but there are bombings that are taking place much earlier on. There's some explosions as a result of anti-aircraft defenses. These are there because there's aircraft taking over in the area of Stabia, which is Stabai, is a little bit south of Pompeii. There's bombings, there, the bomb falling quite near the Villa of the Mysteries, another later on here in October 1922. So it's not just a one-off situation. There is bombings that are taking place from the declaration of war by Italy, and predominantly, obviously, by the British at the very beginning. But there is undercurrents of uncomfortableness. Now, I've talked about Maori here and his connections to the fascist regime. This is coming from his diary, and it's coming from December 1941, as it says here, but you can see his discomfort with the German presence in Italy. Now, this sort of gives you an idea that it's a very contemporary account, but this is something that's written in 1956. So it probably is extracts from his diary that he has sort of adjusted a little bit later on in terms of hindsight. But it goes back to the point of saying perhaps at this stage he might be trying to apologize a little bit for his connection with the Italian fascist regime, perhaps or perhaps not. As I said, he might have been very prudent in terms of being an academic and a scholar and where he's getting funding. So as we move along, I talked a little bit earlier on about, German visitors. This is a nice image that's, I think, is taking place around the 1940s, where we see a German NCO here, and at least, I think, 2 or 3 Italian soldiers and other German soldiers joined together, which showed sort of illustrating that alliance between these individuals. So it's not just the Italians that are in Italy, but there is a German presence there too. Moving a little bit further, moving towards, as I was saying, spring 1943, Italy, I said to you earlier on, is a tourist spot, but it also becomes a place to recover. And I'm mentioning here the 16th Panzer Division. They're resting from Stalingrad, but also the Hermann Göring Division. They're also resting here. And these are two significant units that are going to be part of the story of the bombing of Pompeii. Now, I don't know if these are individuals that are coming from the 16th Panzer Division. Perhaps some of them might be African Corps. I don't know, but it does give the impression of a sort of quite a peaceful image that's in Pompeii at this time. And I'm presuming these are Italian civilians that are helping them on their tour group. I do particularly like this individual here in the middle. It does seem to be quite modern. I think this also further illustrates the point about Pompeii becomes, or Italy is a place of recreation, not just recreation, but of recovery. And what we can see here are German officers being lifted on litters. You can see here their crutches, and you do get an impression, I suppose, of the difference between NCOs and officers. I'm guessing these are NCOs here in the background that don't have something to help them through. I'm guessing that this gentleman here might be Luftwaffe, but it does again go back to the point that it's a place of recovery and does give you an impression of sort of a relative level of peace. Perhaps this is an Italian fascist officer, I'm not sure. But again, putting things into the wider context, I already mentioned to you a little bit earlier on that Italy was subjected to bombings from the very start once the declaration of war takes place. And I think this illustrates the point very well. Almost 7,000 attacks taking place and 10,000 tons of munitions have been dumped on Italy in various strategic and tactical areas. Naples, as I presume you all know, is quite close to Pompeii. This is where Morani himself comes from, and it's the subject of at least 200 bombing raids from 1940 to 1944. So they're bombings that are taking place all the time. So they are really feeling the dramatic impact of war. So this is all a prelim to trying to get Italy out of the war. And that really starts with the victories in Africa and ultimately moving on towards the invasion of Sicily, where we have Operation Husky. Taking place in July and August of 1943. This is where things really start to take a dramatic change for Italy. And as a result of this invasion, Mussolini loses power and he gets dismissed by the king, Victor Emmanuel III, and we have a new prime minister that takes over, Pietro Bagiello. And this would sort of give the impression that we have Mussolini himself doesn't actually take this very seriously until he gets kicked out. But Muriani himself, he's very concerned about this, and I think this is quite well illustrated here by what he's saying from his diary. He says there's no time to waste. Hopefully you can see what I've underlined here. He's worried about invasion taking place, but the other thing he's very much worried about is teams of thieves and bandits destroying and stealing elements from the Pompeian site. So he's very much concerned about that, and it's nicely summed up here. But who will save these monument housings and paintings from the fury of the bombings? So this is him in July. So it's obviously a great concern, and he takes on it as part of his duty to try and do something about that. And he goes to the Minister of Education, Umberto Bianco, who I'm also, as far as I know, he's also a fellow archaeologist, but doesn't really get anywhere with him, which you can, again, you can understand, Pompeii is important, but given what's taking place in terms of the Mussolini being removed, they're still, Italy's still part of the war effort. A new government is taking over. He's not really going to be focusing on protecting the likes of Pompeii or Herculaneum or Paestum. But Mussolini takes it further and says, and there's quite a bit of debate about this. The next passage here that I want to sort of draw your attention to is he's talking about a battery. He's referring to anti-aircraft guns that have been placed in the area of the excavated remains of Pompeii, and he refers to being quite close to the Villa of the Mysteries. And he suggests a little bit earlier on, in particular, in the Tower of Mercury, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later on. So hopefully you remember, I'm planting again another seed here. So you can see that how he sums up in quite a depressing way. So all my efforts to make Pompeii a neutral zone, free from war offences, were in vain. So just to re-illustrate the point that, this is something that's probably writing about in hindsight. So I already mentioned to you about Naples being attacked. Why it's a target, as again I suggested to you earlier on, there was naval bases here and probably submarine bases too. We had U-boat crews that were visiting, and that's why I showed you that image earlier on. And a lot of these raids are taken by B-17 Flying Fortress, which were massive bombers. And they still don't really know how many casualties were as a result of these bombings. 2,000 to 25,000 individuals. So it's a large amount of civilian death and casualties as a result of these bombings. But Naples was a very important strategic focus, given its position on the coast, but also its position in terms of communications between north and south, but also in that gap between Naples and Vesuvius. This gives an impression of some of the damage that's taken place. You can see perhaps some ships. Some of these ships have now gone on their sides, well illustrated here, and also some railroad damage or train track damage has also taken place. And this is just to really illustrate some of that civilian aspect of the bombing raids that take place. So it's not just taking place in the area of Naples, but obviously it said that's the focus, but it is in the rest of Italy too. So this is an Allied broadcast that's taking place around the 2nd of August, which is getting very close to when the bombings are taking place in Pompeii. But you can see here that almost they're trying to give the impression they're trying to get the Italians, the Italian government, and the Italians as a community, as a people, to move against the government and ultimately give in to the Allies. And it's again nicely summed up here. It says, we'd like to avoid you other misfortune from the earlier bombings and take place, but they have no choice. And this is one of the earlier images that I've been able to find in relation to Pompeii, and Pompeii is over here. You can see the amphitheater, but the area in which we're going to be focusing on is this aspect here, which I hope is very clear. But this is an RAF aerial reconnaissance from the 11th of August. So we're getting close to the actual bombings on Pompeii. And this is just an impression of the size of the camera that was used. And I'm always sort of impressed with the clarity of the images that have been produced, that they were able to produce. So ultimately, an armistice declared in 1943 as a consequence of, on the 3rd of September in 1943, as a result of Operation Husky. And as a consequence of this, further troops, German troops, move south from the north. And it's a nice image from Rome. What we have here is a German paratrooper. So this is an idea. This is the policy of the Northwest African Strategic Air Force and what their priorities are. And their priorities ultimately are to paralyze communication systems in Italy. So this is one of the reasons what they're trying to do in terms of their strategic bombings. And this is something that we need to think about in terms of the context of the bombings that takes place in Pompeii. So I'm going to break this into two different groups, the 24th, ultimately the 30th of August, and then the later bombings of Pompeii. I think it's worthwhile focusing on these earlier images because it does give a different impression. Now, the first bombings that take place in Pompeii is on the 25th of August in 1943, and this is referred to in, again, his diaries. And he talks about 3 bombs that are dropped. The area of the Forum is hit, the building of Romulus and Remus, and the Ant Aquarium. And he talks about, the brutality of this violence, but he also applauds the exemplary conduct of the night watch staff. And these are important individuals as they're taking notes of the bombings that are taking place. And they're the ones who are really sort of risking their lives. So on the 24th, the first bombing raid takes place. This is done by the RAF with the 231 wing, and down the latter one here, the 331st wing, and that's the Royal Canadian Air Force. And I learned when I was looking at this that squadrons are a minor part of wings, so it's quite interesting looking at the structure of the RAF. But they're coming and flying from Tunisia. So they are flying a great distance. It's at least a 6.5-hour flight from Tunisia to their targets in Italy. This is a long and perilous flight, and you sort of have to admire their bravery and courage and their ability for what they did. The objective of this was to hit the Torre Amuratiata, marshalling yards and steelworks. That is their primary target. That's what we have the physical evidence for. And the distance from the site is 900 meters, and they're dropping a tonnage of about 54. And I thought, a little bit of an aside, this takes place on the 1864th anniversary of Vesuvian eruption. So there might be a touch of irony in this. But now, as for those of you that have been following more modern excavations of Pompeii, it's thought that the date that have been given for Pompeii's eruption in August is actually taking place much later, perhaps even in October. But sort of an interesting link there. So they are bombing particular targets, and one of those things that they're bombing or dropping are what's known as blockbusters and cookies. And this is a blockbuster or a cookie, another impression of that here. And you might want to think about, why are they called blockbusters? It suggests that it might be because they can destroy a complete block, but it's a little bit of an Americanized way of looking at things. It's also thought they might have been able to destroy a block of flats, but they're not. They're a very different type of thinking behind this particular bomb. The idea of this bomb is not total destruction. It's really to rip off roofs and open and smash windows to allow air currents to get through for incendiary devices, to encourage the fire and flames from the incendiary devices. So they're a scary weapon, but they're there to encourage maximum damage for the other ordnance that's actually dropped on Pompeii, or not Pompeii, on the targets they're looking at. But there is destruction that takes place in Pompeii, and this is the house of Romulus and Remus, and you can see a certain level of destruction that's taking place here. So there's further ruins to the ruins of Pompeii. Now, it's not just the 24th of August, but it's also the 13th of September. You're actually looking here in terms of the ruins, but it's really there to sort of make the point. Here's further damage that I think from those two dwellings, the dwellings of Romulus and Remus and the adjacent building next to it. The other element I mentioned about being damaged is the Ant Aquarium. For those of you that have visited Pompeii, and hopefully you'll visit this, I have to admit I've passed it so many times and I've never gone in. This is the Ant Aquarium, as it is nowadays, near the Porta Marina over here, one of the entrances into Pompeii. This is what it looked like before the actual bombing. And here is an inventory list. And where we see these elements written in red, those are what have been damaged and lost as a result of the bombing. And it's thought that it wasn't a cookie that was dropped here, but it was a large bomb of about 1,000 pounds. I mentioned to you earlier on the cookie themselves about 4,000. And this is the plan of it just before the bombing. And this is some of the destruction here. So This was the worst kind of damage that actually took place as a result of the bombing on that night of the 24th. Here are some metal artifacts that are still in their damaged aspect as a result of that bombing. And here again, some images, how it looked like before the actual bombing and as a result of the bombing. This is after the Allies have liberated Pompeii, because you can see an American soldier here over on the right-hand side. The other damage that takes place is within the forum. Now, I didn't know about this, obviously, until I put together the lecture, and the damage is here. Again, this is taken after the liberation of Pompeii. We can see American female troops here, and this is how it looks like nowadays, because every time I've walked through this archway, I always wondered, why didn't they do something about that hole? It's really irritating, but now I can make the point that this is a result of a bomb that was dropped there. And as I was saying over here, about a 500-pound bomb. So one of the smaller bombs that was used by the Allied raids. And I've already pointed out to you, this is the Via de Abbondanza earlier on, but we're looking at this area here. This is the area that's got hit by the bombs on the 24th of August. One bomb probably in this location here in the forum. The Ant Aquarium is over here, and the dwellings I mentioned here are over here. So they are on the western part of Pompeii. And this is how the Italian newspaper, one of them has referred to this, talking about it being no justification for it. It's brought about by barbarians. There's no justification because there was numerous illuminating rockets. These illuminations were flares that were put down by earlier bombers to mark the actual particular targets. So there is obviously some anger here from the Italian newspapers, as you would expect. Here we have an illustration from the Times. A few days later on, the Naples railways bombed again, and also from the Mirror. This is the Australian Mirror that refers to the damage being fairly negligible, but it does say that there was damage that takes place as a result of the raids in Pompeii. This is looking from the operation reports, so the record book and operations intelligence summary. And I want to point out here about refers to being well concentrated. And a sad element of it, I talked about, this is a 6-hour, maybe 6.5-hour flight. And here we have aircraft U did not return to base, believed to have been shot down over the target. So not everybody came back as a result of these bombing missions. But it does give the impression that these are well concentrated, and also seems to suggest, well, why did Pompeii get hit if the targets were the aiming was done very well? These are coming from the individual operational reports, and it talks about misalignment of launch as a result of German anti-aircraft fire, but also about smoke caused by explosions. And you can see these individual reports here. Target not easy to find as an account of low cloud. Weather was good but hazy. Also refers to first stick not observed, but in the same area, bombed through cloud after 2 dummy runs. So they were trying to actually hit their targets, but it was not easy. And also these are nighttime bombing raids that are taking place. And again, to illustrate the point, they've been flying a great distance. And you could add it to that, the complexity of trying to find their targets. A lot of them must have been very tired. But other bombs didn't just fall on Pompeii, but other areas around Boscarelli, which is a little bit further to the west, and Stabii as well, which is further down to the south. So it's not just Pompeii that's been hit inadvertently away from the actual original target. So this is where they're actually looking for, and these are the list of targets. The ruins of Pompeii is over here, and it's very close to the particular targets in Torre Annunziata over here. So this would explain why Pompeii does get hit. It's as a result of collateral damage. The marshalling yards I mentioned in the operational reports in terms of targets is here. So just under a kilometer, less than a mile away from the Pompeian ruins. And this, I think, sort of illustrates the point. again, how close with the areas in which that were hit, as I pointed out earlier on, are over here. Pompeii itself didn't get hit by any of the blockbusters. There was 6 blockbusters, but there was quite a lot of damage and destruction that takes place over the target area. And this taking place later on, the 20th of September, but does illustrate this reconnaissance image that's taken place of the actual bombing on the target area, which is part of the commune of Naples. One area that, some of you have been visited Pompeii, you might be thinking about, well, this is quite close to the Villa of Plontis. And it's a very attractive villa. You can see lovely frescoes here. But luckily enough, this wasn't although this was discovered in the 18th century, this actually excavated in 1964, so much later than the actual bombings on Pompeii. So again, trying to think about putting things into context, the excavations much later than the bombings on Pompeii, they weren't actually fully aware of that. In reference to going back into the bombing raids that are taking place, you can see Mercury, he's again making points about, he's giving his account to the BBC Italian service, that one of the justifications that he thinks might have been for why the Allies bombed Pompeii was because of a German headquarters that was located in the Albergo del Sole hotel by the Porta Mariana. So there is no evidence that this was ever a target. It also doesn't seem to be any evidence of the fact that there was a German headquarters here. There might have been some German troops that were in hotels along that part of outside Pompeii, but it certainly doesn't seem to. It does seem to suggest that it was the result of collateral damage, and this is why I'm showing you the point. There was hundreds of raids that are taking place all around Italy. It's not just close to Pompeii that there are raids taking place. Second raid that takes place quite close to 29th of August. I mentioned to you about the site staff that were looking after Pompeii. This is not mentioned in any of the diaries. The targets again are the marshalling yards, but there are areas that do get hit as Boscarelli, which is quite close to Pompeii, but nothing seems to have touched Pompeii. This is the first US Army Air Force, that's US Air Force bombing around in the area of Pompeii. And this is just over a kilometer. And these are daylight bombings that are taking place. Moving on to the 30th of August, we have some of the same squadrons and some of the same wings again from the RAF and Royal Canadian Air Force. So you can imagine again the tension that must have existed in these airmen that you're going out for a further bombing mission over these great distances. And what I would draw your attention to is the 231st Wing, and in particular the 70th Squadron of the RAF. And this is of particularly interest for two particular incidents. I want to talk about one of these incidents now. But their target again is the marshalling yards a little bit earlier on. But they did have to deal with anti-aircraft in the Boscarelli area. Their target is just over a kilometer away, so further distance away from Pompeii. But I've talked about, the RAF and Royal Canadian Air Force doing the bombings and part of the wings, but individual squadrons would have had particular targets. Now, here we have the 70th Squadron, and it has been suggested that this individual here, Commodore Duke, in his Wellington X of the 70th Squadron, bombed the railway junction, which was just less than half a mile east of the target, but is very close to the excavator remains here of Pompeii. Here the excavator remains, and here is the railway station. For those of you that visited Pompeii, might be familiar for the long queues of people along that particular station. That's the station of the Villa of the Demistries. And here we have again Maori again talking about his experiences, but talking about the first incursion. But he's also been told, or it's been suggested, that there's going to be no further damage to Pompeii. He takes a certain level of solace in that, but ultimately that was not true, so he feels a little bit cheated. But he does go back to the point that it was an alleged military objective. And I suppose it illustrates the point I mentioned a bit earlier on about the anti-aircraft gun that has been suggested that was located quite close to the Tower of Mercury, which we'll talk about later on, but also the thought about there being a German headquarters quite close along the gate, the Porta Marina. But things move forward and things change in terms of the Allied bombing and bombing missions, moving from tactical to strategic as a result of Operation Avalanche, which is the invasion of mainland Italy. And we're going to focus really on Salerno, but they also removed on the toe of Italy. This as part of that invasion. Salerno was a bit of a disaster. It was a difficult landing for the Allies, and things well illustrated by this image here, and also again further here. But initially they did quite well. They managed to take over the area of Paestum, and this is an idea of how they'd actually moved inland. Still a difficult area to move inland from the 12th of September. And this is an area I showed you the illustration of Mercury himself showing Mussolini around Paestum. And here we can see sort of charming images of American troops in those spectacular Greek temples in Paestum here, the Temple of Hera. But from the 12th to the 17th, we have major counterattacks by German forces, in particular the Himmler-Göring division, but also the 14th Panzer Division. And they're trying to move the Allies away from their beachhead. And they're moving south from the area of Naples, but between Naples and the Allied areas in Salerno is the roadways by Pompeii. And there is, as I said, moving a little bit away from strategic to tactical bombing. They're trying to stop German forces from moving south. And one of those targets, we can see a very obvious illustration of the level of bombing that takes us in Berlioz. And we have an image of here of the bombings that are taking place. This one, you know, obviously the destruction itself looks terrible, but it's interesting. We do have a portrait here of Mussolini amongst the destruction that's taking place, and here can some of the actual bombings that are taking place, but you can see the main road moving through here. So they are bombing those route ways so that allow them to consolidate their forces on the beachhead and reduce German forces and their counterattacks. So this is moving on to the second stage of the bombings that are taking place around Pompeii, or on actual Pompeii. And again, we've taken place from the director of the excavations, and he was referring to, and he suggests in his diary, some of the reasons as to why the Allies might have thought about Pompeii as being a target. Talk about, you know, armed men and munitions, small groups of visitors or deserters that are noted in the theatre, might have been where they're gathering troops from the reconnaissance flights. We don't know, but it sort of sounds logical. The other thing is about the corrugated efforts to try and cover some of the preservation remains. Might look a little bit like barracks from aerial reconnaissance. Also, there's idea that, you know, people are spreading rumors that there is a German stronghold there, and there's a whole German armored division that was encamped on the rooms. So when you're given this information, you can imagine why Pompeii would be a target. But it goes back to the point I'm suggesting to you and been pointing out, is really Pompeii itself was collateral damage as a result of the Allied bombings. So 4 days as a result of from the invasion in Salerno, things becoming fairly desperate for the Allies. So the aerial bombardments become a much more important focus. This is 4 days, and this is the day of the counterattack by the Germans. So you can see a greater emphasis of bombing missions by the US Air Force, but also the RAF and Canadian Air Force. And this is where I can at least attribute some of the photographs to some of that damage. This again, quite close to the Porta Marina, where the earlier bombings are taking place. You can see the level of destruction, and quite a lot has been lost. You can see from how it looks like today, which is most unfortunate. Again, another illustration. I don't have an illustration of what it would look like before, but you can see there's not really that much in terms of ruins that's left over, in contrast to the background area here. But this was a large domestic dwelling which seems to have been completely lost as a result of the bombing that took place. A more sort of smaller elements is, you can see this decoration here that would have been the front of a dwelling on the roadway down to the Porta Marina, the Pelta from the photograph from the latter part, just before the Second War, and that has been completely lost. But this is where we can see it's even closer to some of the targets of Pompeii. This is the target here. We can see road networks here and a junction. But another area to focus on, so we're looking at some of the later bombing missions, is the junction of road networks plus also rail networks here just to the west of Pompeii. Modern Pompeii as a town is over here. Further bombing raid that's taking place, again, another one by the RAF. I'm not going to go through all the specific aspects, but further away, about 1-2 kilometers away from Pompeii, just about a mile and a half. But their target here from the operation is the Goring division, trying to prevent them from moving south. And this is coming from a report from the 142nd Squadron. That was their specific target. So there is a movement to, as I said to you, from from strategic to tactical bombing. Further mission that's taking place by the Americans this time, again, the purpose is the Himmler Göring Panzer Division. So they're trying to prevent this aspect, the German troops moving south to support the counterattack against the Allies. And at Maori, he's again very concerned as a result of the earlier bombings that have taken place in the area. And he's talking to the German commanders, again reiterating that point that there were Germans around the area and trying to get them to remove from the Villa of the Mysteries, which is just outside Pompeii. And it's very well known for the remains, the frescoes. But as I said to you, the first bombing campaign, there were some bombs that bombed quite close to this area just before the reference to bombings mentioned a bit about August. Now this is where we see a change from the medium bombers to heavy bombers of B-17. These are aircraft that are flying at a greater height, so in terms of accuracy is probably going to be greatly reduced. But was a scary aspect of this bombing mission on the 14th of September, it's only 200 meters away from the excavations of Pompeii. But again, you can see the targets. They are aware of the ruins of Pompeii, but the targets are to the west of Pompeii, looking at the highway and railroad, highway junction, crossroads further south, road junction immediately east of Torre Artiata, which, as we know, is over to the west of Pompeii. And this again from the actual operational logs. You can see here talking about the excellent coverage of hits. So the overall reports are always quite good, but as I've shown to you earlier on, the individual reports from the actual airmen and the squadrons don't seem to reflect that level of accuracy. But what we have here, and this is what I was talking to Cheryl a little bit earlier on from the image that I'm using to advertise and promote this lecture, is coming from an aerial photograph in September at 10:30. And you can see quite dramatically targets being hit along the junction. Main target is this area here. But what is quite scary is you can see the level of cloud coverage as a result of bombing, and also probably bombs that are landing in Pompeii on this western part of Pompeii. This is a little bit later on, a few hours later, but you can see this area here is the main area of the main target area, a little bit close up, but you can see the density of bombing is much higher than what we see over here, which is quite close to Pompeii. So although there's quite a number of misaligned bombs that are landing in the area of the excavation area, most of them are hitting broadly the target, and I can't illustrate enough, broadly hitting the target area. And again, illustrating how close they are to the ruins of Pompeii. And this is work that's been done by Italian researchers, and showing that the level of average error range is 365 meters, which is quite high. And this is the target is only 200 meters away from the excavation of Pompeii. So you should be able to understand why Pompeii does get hit in terms of collateral damage. As we move through, we can see there's further targets been hit around the area from various distances from Pompeii. Now, I tried to illustrate sort of the human aspect when I was talking about the bombings of Naples, but even the director of Pompeii himself, he also gets hit. It's not just talking about looking at the bombing missions of Pompeii, but there are also fighter aircraft that are probably supporting bombings, or even reconnaissance, and they were seeing individual targets. Unfortunately, Marari himself became a target when he gets strafed. It's not just him that gets wounded, but unfortunately, one of his fellow excavators is actually killed. So I think he does illustrate some of the civilian casualties as a result of the bombings of Pompeii. And he, as a result of this, to go back to him, he had to use a walking stick for the rest of his life. Again, a further illustration of bombing missions, but again, want to illustrate the point about the 70th Squadron. This is a list of some of their targets they're looking at. Again, he's showing and illustrating the awareness of the actual Pompeian ruins. Target here, the Himmler-Göring Grenadier Division. And further illustration about Pompeii, Pompeii, Pompeii. So they are well aware of the fact that Pompeii, not just the town, but also Pompeian ruins are quite close by. But and this gives you an image of some of the targets. You can see they're following the route network along here just to the side of Pompeii itself. And what becomes more significant is the Via di Abbondanza along here. Going back into I mentioned to you a little bit earlier on about the 70th Squadron, all those images, all those references, operation reports from the squadrons show awareness of the ruins of Pompeii, but this one here is perhaps the most concerning. Talks about the crossroads west of the Pompeian ruins, but this latter one here aimed a crossroad running through Pompeian ruins. So this would seem to give the impression that the excavation ruins themselves have been particularly targeted. Now, again, I suppose it does depend on how you look at the idea of aimed. Maybe it was used as a means so they could follow through on their target. Didn't actually bomb Pompeii, but we don't know exactly which of the ruins of Pompeii, but we don't know what the specific target. I mentioned to you earlier on about the Tower of Mercury. Now, Tower of Mercury itself is one of those fortified towers around the fortifications of Pompeii, very impressive, but it suggests there was an anti-aircraft gun here. There doesn't seem to be much evidence for it, although the fact that Marari himself says there was one here, that this might have been one of the reasons why the Allies bombed along Pompeii. This is where the Tower of Mercury is here, and this might be one of the crossroads that has been referred to in that operational report from the 70th Squadron of the RAF. However, much of the bombing that does take place, that does actually hit Pompeii, is really along the Via di Abbondanza. So if they were targeting this route, this is where they were looking at. But again, as I said, it's more than likely this might be part of their aiming element for targets down here. We just don't know. Maybe I'm trying to excuse what's taking place. I don't know. But given the number of bombs that actually do hit Pompeii, it does seem to be relatively low. Further bombings are taking place on the 18th of September, again, different targets. But I want to move away from running through different types of squadrons. And this is a time when we can sort of get an idea of the level of destruction that takes place in Pompeii. This Insula Occidentalis, which is going down quite close to the Porta Marina. The house of the Crypta Portico, severely damaged as a result of bombings that take place. Now, this is the inside. Again, you can see the ruins and the bombing damage that takes place. The saddest elements and the loss of Pompeii, and this is why I talked to you earlier on a little bit about Vittorio Spinzola, is along the Via di Abbondanza, and these are one of the buildings that was lost. We have some good black and white photographs of this, the facade of this building, but this is a color impression of what it might have looked like, what it did look like when excavated. These are some of the earlier images. You can see the graffiti on the exterior of the building. So very important illustrations of what we would have seen had they not been bombed. And this is a result of the debris. You can see the facade of the building and some of the interior stuff is completely destroyed. And this is the Via di Abbondanza that I showed you earlier on. So tragic loss as a result of the bombings or accidental bombings that take place in Pompeii. What we have here is after the Allies have liberated the site, we can see some, looks like American airmen here looking at some of the ruins and the debris. And these are some of what does survive in the modern day. Luckily, these have survived because an awful lot of these elements have not been lost just because of bombing missions, but have been lost because of exposure. So we shouldn't always be very critical of the destruction that takes place as a result of bombing. A lot of the destruction has taken place in Pompeii. It's been much more gradual. The bombing is much more dramatic, but because of the exposure from the earlier excavations. This lower one here gives you an idea of what survived, the darker elements when Spinzola's excavation, and here you can see the loss and how it looks like nowadays. I showed you earlier on this as it was being excavated in 1912. This is just before the bombing raid that takes place. Again, some of the destruction. In this case, I think it's RAF individuals that are visiting the site looking at some of the destruction that takes place in Pompeii. Further destruction, you can see the reconstructed balcony that has been lost as a result of bombing. Further frontage of probably an elite dwelling that has been lost. Here you can see a photograph and some images or drawings of it. And the impressive columns within. Again, this frontage has been completely lost, and a lot of the columns here in the background have been knocked down as a result of the bombs that landed in the Via di Abbastanza. And here we can see a little bit of efforts to try and reconstruct the site after the bombing campaign and how it looks like nowadays. This is the Casa de Vetti, the House of the Vetti. This is reconstructions that are taking place as a result of damage. Why I want to show this one is really, there hasn't been too much damage, but it's a little bit my obsession with shops. Here we can see a reconstruction of a shop door. Here's a plaster cast of that shop door, which has been completely lost. Perhaps the most dramatic one is the scolia, which this again reconstruction of what it might have looked like. This is how it was excavated. So there is between that and the previous one quite a level of reconstruction that takes place. And this is just before the Allied bombings. Again, a very impressive looking building, but this upper part here is reconstructed. And this is a result of damage of the bombing that takes place. There was a bomb that landed just over here. So it's not just the scolia that has been damaged, but also the adjacent shops to the side. And in this case here, this is the scolia here on the right hand side, is this shop front here. And you can see a plaster cast of the shop front, which again has been completely lost. See, I can't move away from shops. They're just too important. Now, the scolia itself was reconstructed after the Second World War, but it did fall to pieces in 2010. So the reconstruction after the Second World War was not very good, and this is a result of destruction because of heavy rain. So the reconstructions or the consolidation that was taking place as a result of Spinzoli and Mercury were much more steadfast than after the Second World War, which probably is a result of limited finances that were involved. But also remember, it's not just Vesuvius, this is a seismic area, so there were earthquakes that do cause destruction to Pompeii as a site. This is in the Pleistrum, which is just close to the amphitheater. Again, a bomb's landed here. And a dramatic image from the amphitheater, you can see a bomb crater. So this is towards the 20th. Probably one of the last significant bombings that's taking in Pompeii. Why I'm showing you that one is, again, some of the targets themselves are very close to the ruins of Pompeii. The other target is actually Pompeii as the town, the modern day Pompeii. But what I want to illustrate is this area here. Close-up of here is the House of the Faun, which is regarded as one of the most unfortunate losses as a result of the bombings that take place in Pompeii. In this case, you can actually see a bomb hitting, and you can see where it was an actual target, which we can't really see in this lower part here around the forum area. So this is the Casa del Forno, which hopefully some of you will have seen, and this is some of the reconstruction that's taking place. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to, or fortunately, there's not really that many good images of the destruction that takes place, but this is how the atrium area was before the bombing, and this is how it is nowadays, with the more colorful people that are standing around in the site. And in the House of the Fawn, they have preserved one of the actual bombs, obviously disconnected, on the actual site, which you can still see nowadays, as far as I know. And this is an image of modern day Pompeii during one of the bombing raids that takes place. So it's not until the 20th of September that Pompeii itself gets liberated from the 23rd Armored Brigade, but also American paratroopers. But Pompeii is not significant to them. They're just going by. It's part of their campaign going to Torre, and it's at Dianta. That's where they're moving on to. Naples itself gets freed on the 1st of October. And this is some of the destruction that the Allies were confronted with in Naples. And this is in Pompeii. So the streets of the Via de Abbondanza, which I talked to you earlier on about, haven't been cleared in the period of October. And this gives you an impression of where there are reported bomb craters or where there have been bomb hits. So quite a number of bombs have actually hit the excavated site. I think it's about 153, maybe a little bit higher. But in terms of coverage, it's not really that dramatic, but it's still quite a number, despite the fact that this probably is a result of collateral damage, as I was saying a little bit earlier on. So I talked to you a little bit earlier on about the Grand Tour, and you should be thinking, for those of you who have seen the charming film, The Monuments Men, you might be thinking, well, what were the Monuments Men doing in this? They regarded Pompeii in the terms of 3-star category, one of the highest categories. So it's a site that should have been preserved. But they had limited ability in trying to stop some of these bombing raids that take place, because the priorities are going to be military targets, saving military lives. So they were well aware that there were issues with Pompeii, but if we think about the wider context, looking at the Hague Conventions, and even looking at the terms of looking at the Allied Air Force and Manual of Military Law here from the War Office, they want to try and avoid damage to historical sites. But if there are troops or there are places for munitions, these lose that heritage factor and they do become a military target. So I said to you earlier on about, perhaps the anti-aircraft gun, troops in the element of Pompeii. So you perhaps could understand why it might have been target, or why there's a myth to support the idea that Pompeii, the ruins of Pompeii, were a target by Allied bombing. And that's perpetuated by reporters that visit the site after the bombing campaigns. Here we have, Matthew Halton, a Canadian correspondent, speaking from the Roman amphitheater, talking about the fact there was a German gun position here, which does not seem to be true, but that sort of perpetuates this idea, or perhaps justifies not necessarily the deliberate, but the actual accidental bombing of the ancient site. This is again from Maxis, from the one of the Monuments Men, referring to he's getting information from part of the rumors that existed from the Italians about a German command post in the hotel near, or German tanks that were located quite close to Villas of Mystery, which helps again justifies why there were some bombings that take place. This is Mortimer Wheeler, which becomes a very well-known archaeologist. And you can see quite a dramatic way of writing about it. But his interesting account here, which I've underlined here, about they've been told that there was a German armored division, perpetuating that myth, but also it talks about map reading error, that Pompeii was more significant than what he describes as the insignificant modern townlet of modern day Pompeii. So he's suggesting that it might have been accidental bombing of the ancient ruins, thinking that was a modern day town. So bringing this idea again, talking about the damage of Pompeii, talking about the times, is a little bit later on, that because there was a German presence here, that it was treated as a military objective. This doesn't seem to be true, but that perpetuated myth seems to continue in the media. And this is Spike Milligan, moving away from a brigadier general to a gunner. Spike Milligan, I presume most of you will of an age group where we know who Spike Milligan was. He again goes along. He was shocked to find out that the place was bombed because of German infantry was hiding there. But why don't they bomb the pyramids? There might be Germans hiding there. He's actually disgusted that the Americans would actually bomb Pompeii, which is interesting because he again is perpetuating a different myth. And I've been suggesting, telling you a little bit earlier on, majority of the bombs actually landed on Pompeii as a result of bombing by the RAF and the Royal Canadian Air Force, as opposed to the US Air Force. But once Pompeii gets liberated, it does become a site for the Allies to visit. And some of these individuals, whether it be airmen, soldiers, or naval personnel, some of them were acquiring bits and elements from the actual sites, but it does become a major tourist destination. I think it's well illustrated here by these female military members having a tour of the actual Pompeii once it's been cleaned up. Here we can see, I presume, our soldiers in the amphitheater. I think these are New Zealand troops over walking down the Via di Abbastanza. And here we some naval, US Navy troops, sailors walking down the streets. And it's a nice, charming image of US airmen standing in front of the Temple of Zeus or the Capitoline Triad. The bomb I pointed out earlier on is just behind this area of the podium. So summing it up as a result of what the monuments meant, they talk about 156 bombs. There was some regrettable damage, but it really wasn't too bad. And this is reiterated by Maori himself a little bit later on. Most merciful, either they hit minor buildings or less important parts of the beautiful houses. But you can see from some of the images that I've shown that it has been significant damage that has taken place as a result of the bombings of Pompeii. And Pompeii was not just important for the Italian military in the fascist period. Here we can see Allied troops having a victory parade through the amphitheater in Pompeii, what I think is quite nice. It looks like we've got a French military general, I presume, British here, American, and looks like Indian soldiers doing a guard of honor. So what further evidence do we have of some of the bombings of bombing campaign? This is a result of clearing some parts to make it more accessible to individuals. You can see a crater as a result of the bombing. I've also showed you the crater that's been preserved near in the forum itself. But although there's been a big effort to clear the bomb damage, some unexploded bombs still exist, and has been suggested there might be about 10 still in existence somewhere in Pompeii. So part of modern day excavations, they do have to be quite careful during their excavations. So hopefully I've given you a good impression of the context in which these bombings have taken place. Just want to acknowledge much the sources that I've gained images from. In particular, I'd refer to Jackie and Bob Dunn, Pompeii in Pictures, an excellent site. But it shows what you can actually do without actually going to a library and putting together as a result of COVID. I'd like to thank Cheryl Watson and Sarah Jennings for allowing me to put this talk together, particularly for Cheryl, who's been sort of supporting me today, Peter Hunt and Katie, they will know exactly what I'm talking about, and they gave me an awful lot of help in dealing with a PDF that's having difficulty with. So again, thank you very much. I hope you found the talk interesting. I'm going to stop talking now briefly, I suppose, but I'll leave the floor open metaphorically for any questions that you might have.
Excellent. Do you know, I've learned so much there. I don't think I've been to Pompeii twice, and I didn't know any of that. So it's quite interesting. So if you have any questions, if you can see the chat box. If you can't see the chat box, if you look at the foot of the screen, you should have a word that says chat. If you click on that, it should open up the chat box. If not, I'll try and unmute some of you. So I do have a couple of questions. So this guy Muri, or Maori, whatever, however you pronounce it, did he continue to excavate throughout, or was he just there trying to oversee things? Hello? Are you still there? Have I muted you? Oh, I've muted you. Hold on. Sorry. Sorry, I just need to unmute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, sorry, you're
Yes.
unmuted, sorry.
Yes, he did, but he was a little bit less involved after the Second World War. Again, probably because he's trying to reconsolidate some of the debris that's taken place. But he was still director of the ruins in 1961. Much of the work, it's not just looking at Pompeii, but that's why I mentioned Herculaneum and Paestum. He was also involved in excavations in Capri before the Second World War. He was a prolific writer in terms of the work that he has done. So I suppose after Pompeii and trying to put Pompeii back together as a result of the Second War, I suppose he probably more focused on that. But there's less excavations that are taking place after the Second World War, which in many ways is a blessing because, as I said, much of the destruction that's taken place in Pompeii is as a result of excavation and the exposure of the ruins and lack of protection to those actual ruins.
Excellent. And so, although he was, well, by the look of the photos, quite heavily associated with Mussolini, he obviously was able to disassociate himself to continue in the role after the war.
Well, that's why I think it's the best way to look at it. He certainly wasn't pushed out of the role by the Italian government or by the Allies. I think he was probably a typical scholar that was, happy to go and be very outspoken about things where it needs to be, but he was also very willing to be quiet if there was funding coming in to fund his projects.
He's a good politician. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So I have if anybody wants to ask a question, you can unmute yourselves now and then ask away rather than if you can't see the chat box. Anybody have any questions? It's a resounding silence. Arena, you've unmuted. I'm sure you've got something to say. You've been to Pompeii a number of times. I know that. Did you?
I had no idea. I genuinely had no idea.
Well, did I sound knowledgeable? That's the important thing for me.
Oh, fantastic!
Oh, great. That's all we need to know. Fine. Thanks. Move on to the next question.
Just one quick question. You talked about the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the Ant Aquarium. Were there any artifacts, objects that were damaged beyond repair that we just don't have anything else the same now, ruined, and we'll never have the same again?
Again, it sort of depends on how you want to talk about artifacts. Now, the buildings themselves obviously have been completely destroyed. Some of those, the elements that were in the Ant Aquarium, a lot of those were destroyed. That's why I wanted to show you the point of the metal objects and how they've been damaged. So there has been elements that have been completely lost. But Pompeii is a massive site, and I suppose in terms of percentages, the loss is quite small, but it's still sad that things were lost as a result of warfare. When we're looking at when we're doing our learning in the library, try to do things in a very peaceful way and reading through stuff, and they're a tragic consequence of, I suppose, man's inhumanity to man. But yes, there was stuff that was lost. Some of the things that were lost is not just objects and artifacts, but also the plaster casts that we have of the graphic suffering of individuals that died in the result of Pompeii. So some of those casts themselves were also lost.